Hey guys, welcome to the We Study Billionaires YouTube channel by the Investors Podcast Network. I'm your host, Clay Finck. I host the We Study Billionaires Podcast, which is the #1 stock investing podcast in the world. I recently picked up Guy Spier's book, The Education of a Value Investor. And honestly, this is one of my very favorite books I've ever read when it comes to investing and books I've covered on the We Study Billionaires podcast. William Green, who is also a podcast host on the Investors Podcast Network, actually helps Guy with writing the book, so it's no surprise to me that this book was such a hit for readers. During this YouTube episode, I wanted to share 5 big takeaways I learned from reading Guy Spier's book. For those of you who don't know Guy Spier, he's a renowned hedge fund manager who has beaten the S&P 500 by almost 250 percentage points since launching the Aquamarine Fund in 1997. Guy has also been a guest on our podcast several times, the first of which was all the way back in 2014 on our 14th episode, as today we have over 500. So with that, let's dive right into today's episode. All right, so the first lesson from Guy's book that I wanted to share in today's video was to understand the importance of incentives. Charlie Munger is very famous for emphasizing the importance of incentives, as he says that if you show him the incentives, he will show you the outcome. And people are really driven by incentives. And once you understand this, you start to see it more and more in your daily life. Now, Guy started his career working on Wall Street at a firm that really had a very poor reputation. Essentially, Guy's job with the firm that he started out with after college was to find a company that wasn't really any good, and then to dress up that company so it could be sold to retail investors as an investment. And in the process of these individual retail investors getting taken advantage of, many people at the firm would take advantage of each other too. So there was just a really poor incentive structure in place at the company, which really led Guy down a path that made him question himself and question his integrity. In the book, Guy stated that, in retrospect, I had been dangerously blind about the motives and ethics of my colleagues. This was powerful proof of just how dumb even smart, well-educated people can be. It certainly took me far too long to grasp that this business was set up in such a way that if I wanted to win, I would have to lose whatever was left of my moral compass. Understanding the importance of incentives led Guy to eventually setting up his fund in a way that aligned the incentives between his investors and him as the fund's manager, meaning that he would eat his own cooking and would only profit when his investors profited. He profited with investors rather than profiting off of investors. And this is an idea that Guy Spier and Mohnish Pabrai both learned from Warren Buffett when Warren initially set up his own investment partnership. You can also think about how incentives apply to your own life. You can think about your own line of work or whether you're ever out purchasing a product. For example, if you land on a company's website that is selling something and you just look at the website, you can just tell that it overstates the benefits and probably hardly ever mentions any risks or negative side effects with the product. They're oftentimes doing everything they possibly can to hypnotize you into buying because that's exactly what they want you to do. They want to make the most money they can oftentimes. And Guy's book mentioned another book, which is called Influence by Robert Cialdini. And this is an incredible book that teaches people how you can be deceived or influenced into making decisions that aren't in our best interest. I highly recommend that book for anyone that's interested in human psychology in particular. It's just a really great read. So lesson number 1 is to understand the importance of incentives. Lesson number 2 is to create the right environment. There's that saying that you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. In Guy's early career, he lived in New York City, which definitely has its pros and cons. It obviously opened him up to forging many great relationships, but he ultimately decided that he needed to get away from the noise of the city. So he decided that he wanted to move to Zurich, Switzerland, which I believe is where he lives today. He recognized that your environment has an enormous impact on your thinking and your headspace. Also, what Guy did to help improve himself and help improve his environment was to create a mastermind group. He would surround himself with the very best people he could find, and he continued to have calls with these people each week, whether that be Monish Pabrai, Nick Sleep, or Bill Ackman, to name a few, all just incredible investors. There's a ton of benefits that Guy got from this. First, I would say is that he tried to surround himself with people that are better than him, or people that you want to be more like. And that's just extremely powerful, and it's a great way to help take yourself to become more like the person you want to be. Another reason this is so powerful from an investor's point of view is because you get to hear ideas from others, and you get to run those investment ideas by other people. The group of investors would meet once a week, and one of them would pitch a stock, and it would be debated and dissected by the group. So instead of Guy just being in his own headspace and being subject to his own biases, he would be able to run these ideas by all these extremely smart people. Another reason I think this is so powerful is since Guy's not just in his own headspace, he might have 5 really good investment ideas. If each person has 5 great ideas, then that gives Guy potentially 25 great ideas that he can select from rather than just having the original 5. So I think that could just really be powerful and help him discover the very best ideas that are out there. All right, so the third lesson I wanted to share, and probably my favorite lesson, to be honest, is to embrace the compounding of goodwill. There's a little bit of a backstory on this lesson. Charlie Munger recommends reading the book Influenced by Robert Cialdini, which I mentioned. I've read through a good amount of the book, and I can see why Munger likes it so much because it paints just such a good picture to how human psychology works and how people's minds trick themselves into making certain decisions. One example of this is the story of a man who set the Guinness Book of World Records for car sales in a single year. And what he did was simply write short handwritten notes to his former customers, and all he would write was, "I like you." And that was it. Cialdini explains that we're phenomenal suckers for flattery, and we tend to believe praise and those who provide it. So Guy started writing 15 handwritten letters per week to people, just thanking them for a speech they gave, or writing them just to check in, and whatever excuse he needed to write to someone, he would do it. At one event Monish Pabrai spoke at, Guy wrote to Monish to thank him for his great speech after the event, and Monish said that Guy was the only person that wrote to him after this massive event, and this interaction that they had because Guy had written Monish was how they became great friends, and eventually a couple years later ended up going to Buffett's charity lunch together. Spier said that my letter writing crusade had begun as a way of marketing my fund, but it ended up giving me a richness of life that I could have hardly imagined. Rather than becoming a good salesperson, I found myself starting to care about the people I was writing to and to think about how I could help them. The paradox is that as I became more authentic and discarded with my agenda, people became more interested in investing in the fund. This was an unintended consequence of becoming less selfish and more honest about who I am. And I personally just think about how handwritten letters especially are just so rare nowadays, especially now that we have things like email and cell phones. They're just such a good way to stand out from your peers, whether that be trying to get a specific job or get a promotion, or even get in contact with someone that is difficult to get in contact with. For those of you not familiar with Guy, he's been on TIP's podcast on a number of occasions over the years, and you can just see that he's just so willing to share his knowledge and share his insights on life and investing, and he does this with no expectation of getting anything in return, which really goes to show how he really truly embraces this idea of compounding goodwill. All right, the fourth lesson I wanted to share today is to live by an inner scorecard. Once Spier started investing successfully and garnering attention from investors and people on Wall Street, he noticed that many people would give him a call, reach out to him, and tell him all these ways that he could grow his fund. At first, this might seem appealing, but bringing on investors that don't align with your values can really bring its own set of challenges. If the investors only want short-term returns, then you might have headaches with redemptions from investors, and it's much better to have investors that align with your vision. Guy figured out that he really enjoyed researching companies and managing the portfolio, and he really didn't care too much about trying to sell it to others. He just figured that the performance would eventually speak for itself if he did a really good job with managing the fund and delivering returns to investors. And this all really ties back to the inner scorecard. Guy knew that in order to achieve fulfillment and be at peace with himself, he needed to do what he truly believed was right, rather than doing what others thought was right. Whether that be growing his fund as large as it can be, living in New York City, or going to such and such events, or how he spends his time, he decided that the best way to live his life was to live by an inner scorecard and do what he believed was truly right, rather than judging his success or being at peace based on what other people thought about him. And that brings me to the fifth lesson that I wanted to share today, and that's to not take yourself too seriously. This lesson also requires a little bit of a backstory. In his younger years, Guy was someone that took himself very seriously, and he wanted to be viewed as someone that was incredibly successful, so he was living by an outer scorecard, like I just mentioned earlier, and caring most about what other people thought about him. Guy graduated at the top of his class in Oxford, and eventually he went on to try and make a ton of money on Wall Street. Then he discovered Warren Buffett, and he was just blown away and just so surprised to find out how successful he was and how much he enjoyed life while doing it. Buffett always says that he tap dances to work every morning, and he wouldn't want to do anything else rather than managing money for Berkshire. So rather than simply being obsessed with achieving some outcome, Guy learned to enjoy the process and understand that money isn't everything. Outside of Buffett, you look at all these successful people and you can just see that oftentimes they really aren't that happy, and they're oftentimes sacrificing something else in their life to build their business as big as it can be or make as much money as possible. So we want to understand that there's always trade-offs, and money shouldn't be the only thing we optimize for. You want to think about your health and well-being, your family, your relationships, your mental health, your physical health, and all these other things. But I think for a great majority of people, after you have a lot of your basic needs taken care of, then a lot of other things start to matter a lot more, in my opinion. And I think back to my own journey and experience. I initially got my degree and went down a path of getting, a really promising career with really good income potential, really good job security. And then when I was 24, 25 years old, I had the job that I really always wanted and always dreamed of. And I was making a good salary. And then I started to really think about where I was. And I was thinking about, is this really it? This is what I considered to be my dream job when I was 18 years old. And I decided that it really wasn't what I wanted, even though I was making a really good income. And I seemed to be in a really good position by, that outer scorecard, by other people looking in. And I just figured out that I valued other things a lot more than what that job provided. And for those who are in that position where I was in, and you're in that position where you have the job that you always wanted when you were 18, well, that's really good. And that's great if that's in line with who you are and who you want to be in life. So you really just want to live by that inner scorecard and not take yourself too seriously in trying to make the most money as possible or building your business to be as big as it can be. But I knew that I needed to make some changes when I initially went down that path, and I eventually found something much better that was much more aligned with who I was. All right, so those are my 5 biggest lessons I learned from reading Guy Spier's book. There are many more lessons from the book, but these are definitely 5 of the most important for me. If you enjoyed this video, you'll also enjoy the recent podcast episode we released reviewing Guy Spier's book, The Education of a Value Investor. This will be linked in the description below. It's episode 519 on the We Study Billionaires podcast, so you can find that on your favorite podcast app. Also, please be sure to click the like and subscribe button below so you can get updated and keep in touch with future videos we have in store for you. Thank you so much for checking out today's video, and I hope to see you again soon. So during this YouTube video, I'm going to be pulling some of my very favorite clips from William's interview with Monish and adding some color around my biggest takeaways from that interview.